Hi, everyone, and welcome to Himal Interviews. I'm Raisa Vikramatunga, acting editor of Himal Southasian, and I'm joined by public policy analyst Dawar Butt, who is also the co-founder and organizer for Climate Action Pakistan, which is a collective of major climate and environment advocacy groups from Pakistan. For the past few weeks, there have been deeply worrying images and video coming out of Pakistan, which has been experiencing heavy flooding, described as the worst in the country's history. And we're going to be talking about what the situation is on the ground, as well as examining some of the root causes for the exacerbation of flooding in the country in recent years. Thanks, Dawar, for joining us today.
Thank you, Reza.
So just to start off on, I think it was around the 25th of August, Pakistan, I believe, declared a state of emergency due to flooding. And firstly, I just wanted to ask, what is the current situation right now, like now that it's been a few, really almost a month since, flooding really has been, going on. How many people have been affected? How many, displaced? And what's the situation right now?
Actually, it's been more than 2 months now, and the this is one of the stark realities that no one really thought it would get so bad. And by the time the government declared emergency, a lot of the areas were already submerged. We have about 33, 35 million people who live in these regions that have been affected, and we have up to 10 million people who have been displaced at some point. For example, in the northern parts of the country, they were temporarily displaced and they've begun returning to homes. But in Sindh and Balochistan, for example, the areas are still underwater, and in certain parts, they're still under 12 feet of water. Those cities, people will take time to return to those cities, and the government records say that you have nearly 1,500 people who've lost their lives. But this is such a tragedy that you cannot really uh, give a short number at this point. And we hear various reports of how a new body surfaces in another part of town, another city every day. So the death toll is going to increase as well. Then you have the agriculture and livestock losses, because these are primarily rural regions who depend on their economy is primarily rural and livestock related. In terms of livestock losses, you have 1 million livestock lost as well. Uh, People's livelihoods were associated with it. So recovery for them is also going to be a very, very tough process. And then, of course, you have infrastructure losses. Uh, the government has been unable to reach certain parts even right now because roads do not exist anymore. Bridges have been washed away, and electricity cannot be provided because grid stations themselves are underwater. So this is the situation right now. And over the past week, there has been a reduction in flood waters in certain parts, especially the freshwater lake called Manchar, which is one of the biggest in Asia. The water started receding in this part of the region because they artificially created certain outlets for the water to exit. But those outlets actually had to go over land, which means that anything between the Indus River and the Manchar Lake was also flooded just to release the waters from the lake. So this is where we stand right now, and I think the coming period will be just as difficult because you have reports of massive disease outbreaks, you have reports of mosquito infestations, you have reports of snakes coming out of the marshes, unavailability of anti venom. So this is where we are right now.
Thanks, Dawar. And, you kind of touched on this when you were answering the first question, but what would you say are some of the differences that you've seen in terms of impact outside, the cities like Islamabad? What are like some of the differences that you're seeing?
Compared to previous disasters, I don't think we've seen this before. And I say this because a lot of the flooding, even the big floods and different sorts of events that have happened, during the monsoon season in the past were related to the river basically flooding the regions around it. In this case, what we've seen is that cities are, of course, big cities are situated nearby rivers. But for example, in the 2010 floods, you have the big city of Multan that was very, very close to getting flooded. The waters had touched the airport of the city. This time around, the eastern branches of the Indus did not flood because it wasn't a riverine flood. What we see was immense amounts of rainfall, and because the region of Sindh is very, very flat in a way, and just because of the riverine floods of the past, a lot of the regions had created these artificial embankments. So, because rain came from up top, now they assumed that the flood water from the river might come at one point and flood the inland areas. But what has happened is that rainwater came and it didn't have any point to exit into the river because embankments were lined along the river for miles and miles. So that's what we have. People were unprepared for, and big cities, of course, we had episodes of urban flooding in all big cities of Pakistan. Cities like Karachi regularly have faced these episodes, and it drastically affects infrastructure over here as well. You have still have a lot of damaged roads. You still have water pipelines that have been damaged, and dirty water gets mixed into it. And in cities like Islamabad, of course, those are like linked to the plains and hilly areas, so the water has points of exit. But these rural areas of Sindh, especially, these are like bowl-shaped flatlands. So it's just very, very difficult to assess how long it will take. And cities, in a sense, big cities, people living there are safe. They have the privilege to be walking around, going around. Um the situation isn't the same in the parts of Upper Sindh and Balochistan.
And you touched on this in the beginning, and there's been footage as well of mass displacement. So what are the kind of immediate needs of all the people who have been displaced right now, and are those being adequately addressed?
So the immediate needs in terms, especially I think this is common to other disasters as well, that clean water, food, and availability of health services is crucial at this point. Uh, we have areas where people are still without temporary shelter, they don't have tents, but there's also the issue that just after monsoon, the heat usually returns and it has returned. So the weather is started touching 40 degrees in areas. People within those tents find it very, very difficult to breathe and stay there for the entire day. So a lot of them actually have preferred to build temporary shelters nearby their own cities on highways. So this is what we've seen, that they are reluctant to stay in relief camps, especially if there's no regular maintenance from the government. They prefer to go to the roads and highways nearby their villages or cities and put up temporary shelters there. And at the same time, some have sought refuge under large shady areas. You have certain parts have those sort of vegetation. The eastern upper Sindh parts do not have that sort of vegetation either. So those are the immediate needs: that clean water and some sort of form of cooling. That means that uh, government might actually have to supply large ice blocks, because that is a way people in these cities already avoided heat. Cities like Jekabad, Kambar, Larkana, in extreme hot months, they used these huge ice blocks to keep themselves cool for water, for drinking, for bathing. So this is the sort of thing that we have to assess, that this month the chances of heat staying are still a lot. It will recede by mid-October, end October, but in the meantime, because of heat and humidity, you also have diseases coming up. So those are the needs: that clean water, ice, perhaps, and then of course shelter that is suitable for these climates, and health services.
Thanks, Tavaria. And to the point that you were making about the spread of disease, I believe the Director General of the WHO just recently said that this is going to be the second crisis that is going to be experienced in terms of the spread of disease. Are we already seeing that happen?
Yes,
In
we are. There are routine reports that just yesterday the government assessment was that 1 lakh people have been treated for various diseases in just one day. So you can assume that this will only increase. And if you have the displaced population in Sindh is about 3 to 5 million. So people, grown-ups, children, women, old people, everyone has a different issue, and a lot of them, in a sense, already had different health issues. For example, you have kidney patients; they require dialysis, so you don't have that availability anymore. Some people require regular checkups. So that sort of treatment also has to happen, but there's a big burden for especially vector-related diseases, which is malaria and dengue. And then you also have dirty water over there. So you have people who have gastro, you have people who chances of typhoid breaking out. So this is perhaps actually going to be a big crisis, and it started in certain areas, and it also sort of is linked to where people are. So in various areas where people manage to shelter themselves, they might be still safe, but people who have been displaced completely, they're very much at risk.
And you were earlier speaking, like if we go back and look at some of the root causes, you mentioned that, it wasn't so much a riverine flood, especially outside, but it was like heavier rainfall than expected. So why do you think, why would you say the impact has been more compared to, previous years of flooding?
I would say in monetary terms, what the estimate we have is similar to the 2010 floods, but perhaps in the coming months it might exceed it by a slight bit. Uh, the impact in this sense is bigger because the human impact, which when we talk about number of people affected, that's very large. And in if you consider the start of the flooding period, which was sometime in July, till right now the floodwaters have receded. But if we account for all the areas that were flooded, you come to an estimate that 1/5 or 1/4 of the country at some point had floodwaters. So even at this point, about 1/10 of the country's landmass has floodwaters on it. So while we look at the riverine floods, it was much lesser and it did not exceed 1/10 at any point. And because it was around the Indus River, so wherever the river was traveling with high floods, those regions were affected. Uh, right now, the primary issue is that the water has nowhere to go. So the human impact, in a sense, in a way of saying that over a time, it's also over a time period. It's not that water will come and go away and you can recover. So the longitudinal human impact is a lot more. And similarly, you cannot assess the fact that what will happen in the coming months because there's no estimate when the rainwater will recede. So for the river, of course, there were certain calculations that these are the points, this is the flow of the water. But right now, in areas there's no flow of water. Those areas will basically have to wait it out, which means either by evaporation or by soil absorption, that water will move, and government will try to intervene by bringing in pumps, by bringing various methods of to clear out the water. But again, there's no assessment of how long that will take. So rough estimates 6 to 8 months. There will be water in areas that are still standing there.
Would you say that the impact of climate change has also kind of led to there being more impact, or is that something that's just kind of being perpetuated in international media?
To sort of give you summary of what we've experienced in the past 6 months. So Pakistan was having a dry spell since late 2020, and earlier reports from 2020 winter onwards, the Met Department had consistently been notifying that there's a drought going on in Pakistan. This was repeated in 2021 as well. And then ICI MOD did assessment of the Karakoram and Himalaya region. and noted that snowfall had also decreased. Now, that when this year started, the river flows were minimal, and by late May, that's when the river actually started to have some water in it. And that was mostly because there was not enough snowfall for the river to have early season flows. So the flows that you had were from glaciers, and they did not come about till we had like very long heat wave. So this heat wave was earlier noted that it was made more likely because of climate change, and when compared to century-old records, it was supposed to not be this extreme or be recurring so frequently. And over the past couple of, I think 2 3 years, this is noted that what we call the La Nina phenomena, it usually does not occur year after year. And what's been constantly pointed out that this is the third year running for the La Nina. It usually does not come more than twice, and more regularly it's just once a year, and then you return to the El Nino phenomenon. A lot this along with the heat wave, and heat wave causing very high sea surface temperatures, encouraging moisture buildup in the atmosphere, then the 3 year recurring La Nina pattern. Well, what we saw was that the monsoon pattern was altered. So you had more moisture in the monsoon, but also the monsoon did not follow its regular path. The monsoon touched the areas that were the most heavily impacted by the heat wave itself. So upper Sindh, parts of Balochistan, southern Punjab, these saw 50, 51-degree temperatures. The monsoon usually goes to upper Punjab and also parts of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, parts of Kashmir as well. It travels throughout India. So what we saw was that it basically turned direction. It was traveling over Rajasthan, and it came over the Sindh province and parts of Rajasthan and did not move any farther. And because it was carrying a lot more moisture, so the rainfall was also a lot more erratic and unbelievably high. So that's what we I have. The information right now says that a lot of these dependent on uh, effects caused by global warming, heat, high moisture content, changing patterns of the monsoon. The La Nina, I'm not sure if it's related, how much of it caused by climate change itself, but I'm sure any assessments that come out, climate scientists have been working on it. They're still trying to assess why it's 3 year long phenomena this time. But these factors combined cause the immense amount of rainfall.
And why do you think, in terms of media coverage, that initially there wasn't really a lot of coverage, especially, when it started in like Balochistan around about June?
So parts of Pakistan have very low media presence. These areas have local media and people who routinely are active on social media. So those are the sources of information that also initially we had. Pakistan's mainstream media, especially the ones that people in urban areas or your policymakers or your people associated with connected with the world outside as well, they don't generally watch your smaller outlets. Your print media as well has a reduced presence, largely because they depend on either freelancers or their own staff reporters, which are situated in more populated areas. In Balochistan, the rainfall was over this mountain range called the Suleiman Range. So it's also a very low densely populated area. You have few settlements there. The problem is that when the water over there flows into populated areas. So the Koh Suleiman is a sharply rising elevated area right next to the plains of Sindh. So any rainfall over there basically becomes very fast streams of water, and those came down on these regions. So initially, the speed of the water broke down protective embankments, and then this kept on flowing into the lake and especially the western part of Sindh. So that's what happened. You had people actually putting up TikToks from villages because TikTok's popular in all over the country as well. So in general, people who were active in these regions, they were putting up TikToks. You had those videos shared on WhatsApp. Similarly, in the northern areas, you had the similar phenomena. The videos we saw of bridges getting destroyed, hotels being basically flooded, and then also being destroyed and taken away by the river. Those videos were also shared by locals on ground, not by our mainstream media. So those are the, I think, overall media presence is lacking. Mainstream media, even to an extent, most people do not know how to really cover climate change in Pakistan or environmental issues in general. And also because the country itself has economic crisis, there's also political turmoil. A lot of this becomes a focus of mainstream media. They want to talk about currency depreciation. They want to talk about food prices. They would show you a little bit of information that in these parts this much rain was recorded, but what was happening that was not in their view.
And we've been talking about human impact and in terms of climate change as well. But would you say that it's fair that the state capacity, or rather the lack of state capacity in certain areas, has also kind of exacerbated the impact of the flooding?
That's very true. Pakistan's vulnerability is one of the reasons we are very highly vulnerable is our lack of state capacity. There are parts of the country where the state is minimal. You wouldn't have your disaster management authorities, you wouldn't have your police services, even health services. So that's very much true. And parts of Balochistan, Sindh, parts of the KB province, there are regions here where the state virtually is non-existent. And traditional authority, for example, traditional local clan authorities, chiefs, etc., those are the ones who get elected in these areas, and they also control the strings of various resources and state authority. So this, in a sense, is also something that has delayed response. Uh, the problem with this is that this is bigger problem than climate change as well, because climate change just exposed these fault lines. It existed before. It has a sort of a governance culture that exists in these parts. It has not been efficient for a long time in terms of resource distribution, in terms of public service delivery. Climate change and this flooding, this just exposes it more. That there needs to be much more investment. There needs to be much more participation by the government in these areas, and to the very local level, the local units, which are the villages and town councils. That's where the government needs to come in and start providing basic services. And at the same time, this means that you will have to develop your governance capacity by actually looking at the needs of the people. So in many areas, even right now, the reason why government does not understand the needs of the people, because over the past many decades, it has not made an effort to really look into it. So that's where that has exacerbated our vulnerability in a sense.
And what about in terms of infrastructure? I think I've seen some discussions about, the construction of dams, for example, and, the impacts that that kind of infrastructure can have. Do you think that Pakistan has kind of invested in disaster preparedness, and why or why not?
So the discussion we've had is that dams would have mitigated or prevented the flooding. But it would have been true if it was similar to 2010 floods when the Indus itself was in high flood. They would not, in this case, from the rain, they would not have really helped. Uh, there's also there's all has been a hugely complex sort of debate between different federating units of the country, that Sindh is a lower riparian part of the country, and by putting up large infrastructure up in the up north of the country and central parts, they've slowed down the water availability to the coastal regions or central parts of Sindh. And because before this flooding, we had a very long heat wave and we had droughts over the past 2 years. This particular region, especially the coastal parts, which are in this delta that is dependent on the flows of the river, has been losing vegetation a lot, has lost a large part of its population because people have been migrating into big cities because there's lack of water, they cannot conduct agriculture, their earnings from fisheries have gone down. So that infrastructure debate also has to account for these things. Uh, in terms of infrastructure locally, which is your access roads and other things, there has been an improvement over the past 15 years that your rural areas were becoming more and more connected. Some of the highways have been refurbished. You had new highways built as well. Uh, but at the same time, uh, dams and what would have stopped is going to be a much more complex debate because people right now have different ideas, and a real assessment would answer that what sort of, if you're looking at the total impact of the floods, what proportion was related to the river, what proportion was related to the hill torrents, what proportion was related to just the rain itself. So that is what we need to sort of disaggregate and then see where investment needs to go. At the same time, Pakistan is already actually building two big dams in the north of the country. So those projects are set to be inaugurated by 2028 or 2030. So you already have infrastructure coming in place over the river. And it isn't like that the growth of dam building has been stagnant in the country. You have multiple small dams that have come about in the smaller rivers, not on the Indus. Uh, Similarly, you would have development in Balochistan where many small dams were built after 2010 floods as well. Some of those have actually been damaged during these floods. So uh, the impact of that sort of mitigation strategy is really unsure at this point.
I think that's a really salient point, Dawar, because yeah, there does tend to be, even in media coverage, this kind of perception that's put forward that, building infrastructure, building highways are going to solve these problems, but rather, the focus should be on human needs and, of course, the root causes, what's actually the most effective way to address these issues. um, but also moving on to response and relief as well. We've all been seeing on our Twitter timelines, there's so many kind of voluntary efforts being shared for relief, which are often coming from nonprofits. What do you think that denotes, and what would you say has been the government response? Has it been adequate to kind of address the needs of people?
So Pakistan has a long culture of non-profits, particularly charity organizations coming about in disasters. We have a huge sort of fleet of ambulances that is run by private organizations. A part of it has formed because of terrorism over the past decade. So response was a lot of related was done by these organizations, and some of it is also specialized organizations working for various health related issues, various child protection issues, women rights issues. So a lot of those have combined their efforts, and they, because they have a on ground presence in these districts already, so they sort of are reliable and have been providing enough. They primarily deal with water, food, and shelter. So that's what they've been doing. The government also is partly assisting them because the district administrations where these non-profits are operational usually require administrative support and also security protection. We have a lot of reports how people who are very angry, they tend to come about and stop caravans of food being carried further. So they want, of course, they want to have food themselves as well. So that's one part where security comes in. Similarly, chances of any sort of theft, chances of any sort of law and order situation while distributing food, because you have chances of people running over each other, you have pushing over in there. So the state does come in to sort of provide this support to non-profits as well. On by itself, it's of course wherever they are present, the schools that existed are still standing. Those are being used as relief camps. This is where government has also put their health services, such as vaccines, such as any life-saving drugs that are available. And all the donations that are being received. So for example, you have countries which have been donating tents and bedding for relief measures. Those have been supplied by the government, and various tent cities have been established over wherever there's basically dry land at this point. And the relief response, wherever the government has been able to reach, they've started to provide these services, but we have areas which are only accessible by helicopters, for example. So government tries to have food drops in these areas, but that's not a very sustainable situation. Helicopters cannot cover large amounts of ground anyway. So the response so far isn't as much as is needed at this point. So perhaps availability of more resources and a more focused approach from the government will be needed. You have calls for donations from the UN as well. Yes, some countries have already pledged certain amounts. Some have pledged resources, some has pledged money. So how the government uses it or how efficiently it manages it is not something that we've seen in the past. So that's a big gray area as well. That we have different disasters that have happened over the past 20 years. We also had the pandemic. So how the government really manages it is going to be a big question mark. As long as you have large bureaucracy that has to be dealt with, it will not be as efficient. That is also why a lot of people actually trust the non-profits more. So this is where we are. Maybe the government can use this opportunity to collaborate more with the non-profits, allow them to take a lead on this. They're also more specialized. They using them will not burden the government services themselves more. It will not require hiring more volunteers or ad hoc employees. So that's where perhaps a better strategy can be used.
And something that's also been discussed, including from Pakistan's government, I believe, is, the possibility of reparations for climate change, since that has been the center of so much coverage around the floods.
Mhm.
Um, do you think there's a case to be made for that? And how would Pakistan go about doing that in that
So
instance?
Pakistan's case, like, especially what the government says, is sort of simplistic because the government tries to explain in terms of debt relief. That the debt we've received over the past couple of years, we cannot repay it because we're going to use the money for rehabilitation. So that's what the government comes about and says. In the civil society or in academia or in among activist circles, the debate is largely around loss and damage. So perhaps articulation from the government has not been good enough because we have ministries which are rarely interested in talking about climate change. The prime minister, successive prime ministers don't have enough knowledge about what climate change is. They're usually helped by specialists, but in this case, what the narrative that has been set is that we're just aiming for debt relief. So maybe in the larger scheme of things, if Pakistan has to really call for reparations, it needs to see how a lot of scientific literature now says that your heat waves, your glacial melting, impacts of glacial melting and heat waves, public health issues, your increased chances of increased erratic extreme rainfall, all have been caused by climate change, which is caused by certain countries of the global north. So the losses on our side have been caused by countries which have effectively been protected from all of this. So we need to talk about more about loss and damage, and we need to perhaps very in a crude way of saying that someone has left a bomb at our doorstep and it started blowing up, but the trigger and everything responsibility of whoever dropped it is neither us nor anyone from our region because this region is completely vulnerable. We need to really hold accountable people who are responsible for this, and that's of course industries and states of the global north.
Thank you, Dawar. Thank you for joining us today and giving us an overview of what's happening in Pakistan at the moment with the
Thank you.
floods.